Welcome back to the Green Party Town Hall here on CNN. Dr. Stein, you're talking about a very provocative and intriguing concept. You said there are 43 million people out there carrying student debt, right? And I know that number, and some estimate that number could be twice that if you look at all the people who continue to carry it up well into adulthood. Many people say it is the new mortgage of this generation. So the question becomes, something as enticing as erasing all student debt begs the question. How could you ever do that? How?
So let me say first, we found a way to bail out Wall Street. And when we needed the money, we found it, including about $17 trillion worth of practically zero interest loans, which was made available, as needed. We found a way to bail out Wall Street, the guys that crashed the economy with their waste, fraud, and abuse. So my point is, as responsible adults, we need to bail out a younger generation that is held hostage in this unpayable student debt. It's terrible for them. It's terrible for our whole society, because it's always the younger generation that leads us forward to create the economy of the future and to lead the social changes that we urgently need right now.
But the concept itself, as enticing as it is, there's one apples to oranges thing here. Quantitative easing, which you've talked about, TARP, TALF, whatever acronym you want to throw at how we dealt with the banks in 2008, right or wrong, those loans, zero interest in some cases, some not, were repaid.
That's right.
So that would not erase student debt, right? Because no matter what interest rate is, you still got the principal.
Right.
So how do you do this? Because it's not going to be the same mechanism as you had with the banks, because they repaid the loans.
That's right.
How would you ever get a Congress that wants to do nothing like this to do anything like this?
So, it was easy for the banks to repay the loans because they're an extremely advantaged and privileged group. They get the money at zero interest, they loan it out at 7%, so it's really easy for them to pay back those loans. Young people are not in that situation. They don't have the jobs that we need. We don't have an economy that can employ them. So here's what I'm suggesting. That debt is largely owned now by the federal government, the vast bulk of it. I'm suggesting that the Federal Reserve actually buy that debt like it did for Wall Street, but in this case, that it buy that debt and it basically declare that debt null and void, which essentially means that the Federal Reserve would be expanding the money supply into the hands of young people so that they can spend it into the economy instead of having to pay back the loans with their hard-earned dollars. They now own their hard-earned dollars. So what I'm saying...
Let me make sure that we understand it. So the Federal Reserve would buy the debt.
Yes.
So they would expire the debt, whatever the accounting equivalent is. We're talking about 1.3 or so trillion dollars.
That's right.
And then you're saying they would also take that amount of money in new currency and give it to the people who held the loans?
No. What I'm saying is that they basically cancel the loans, which is like giving this. It's almost like giving students money. They don't actually give them money. This means that instead of the students paying the bank,
so they retire the entire debt. So you have to go to Congress and say, here's why I think we should expand the debt by $1.3 trillion.
But Chris, and I think we need to make a corrective. Quantitative easing was the creation of money. They created money and handed that money to the banks at the tune of $85 billion a month. Let me say that one more time. $85 billion a month. So if there's mechanisms that can be found to basically prop up the banks, why can't the American people get propped up once in a while?
It's a legitimate question. It's a legitimate question. Believe me, I take no pleasure in being the person who has to check the idea of not having any student debt. But that, unfortunately, is the job. I don't know that that's the best analogy. It is the right political imperative. You found a way to do this, you should find a way to do that. I don't know that it's the same mechanisms involved, though. That's why I'm asking the question.
And I think the point here is that there are many potential mechanisms. Congress could also be asked to come up with the money. But there's another way to do this, and that is the Federal Reserve doesn't need the permission of Congress. This is an act that the Federal Reserve can take on its own. Yes, we would sort of owe that money to ourselves. We would owe that money to ourselves. But as a nation, we have the capacity to do that. We can decide to spend money on ourselves. And in particular, we can decide to spend money on our younger generation who currently does not have a future. Who is more worth spending money on than our younger generation?
All right, let's get another question from the audience. This is Maria Cristina Garcia. She's a U.S. Army veteran. She now works as a Veterans Outreach Coordinator. She does not know who she's voting for yet. What's your question?
Hello, good evening. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Dr. Stein, I have a little bit of a concern. I know that you're advocating for boycotting Israel, and I just want to know, why do you single out Israel, being that they are a democratic ally to us? Why don't you do the same for other Middle Eastern states, and many of which are committing horrific crimes and abuse of people?
So let me reassure you, Maria, that's exactly what we are doing. And I've been very careful to avoid that pitfall of targeting Israel. And what we say is that we are turning over a new chapter, because we ourselves have been as guilty of this as any of our allies. But what we would say, under a green administration, if we turn the White House into a green house, what we're saying is that our foreign policy will be based on international law and human rights. So when we say to Israel that we will not continue to give you $8 million a day when the Israeli army is occupying territory in Palestine, conducting home demolitions and assassinations and things of that sort that are recognized by the UN, we're not going to do it for the Saudis either. They don't get a pass whatsoever. Nor, for that matter, does Egypt get a pass with their incredible human rights violations, and we're giving them not as much, but we're giving them billions of dollars.
Have you advocated to boycott Saudi Arabia?
Yes, absolutely. That's right.
Another follow-up is that Israel is not Saudi Arabia or Egypt. It certainly occupies a special alliance with the United States.
Oh, God,
and
here we go.
Supporters would argue faces an existential
Jesus.
threat that others do not. So do you see Israel as being a special ally and in a unique defensive position in that part of the world?
Well, you know, I happen to be of Jewish origins, so yes, I have a special connection to Israel, and I have family members who are living there part-time. But, you know, I don't think we are doing Israel a favor by condoning a policy that makes Israel very insecure, that makes Israel the target of hostility from its neighbors. And in fact, the current, government of Israel, the Netanyahu government, has a sponsor from someone, a casino magnate living here in the U.S., who's funding and supporting a very aggressive and hostile policy. He's not even living there. I don't think that's good for someone to be influencing Israel's policy when they don't have to live with the consequences.
Well, from a starting position, I understand you have family relations there, but do you believe that as a state, that Israel has a preference as an ally that Saudi Arabia and Egypt or anyone else does not? Do you believe they're a special ally, yes or no?
I believe all of our allies are special allies. Israel and all of them. We are all members of the human family. I think we have responsibilities to everyone to create a world that works for all of us. And by sponsoring a very hostile military policy that violates international law, that doesn't do us any favors. There are people in Israel who are really working for human rights, who are actually building community with the Palestinians. There are human rights groups that are building trust, that are building community, and that are building confidence. These are the groups that we need to be lifting up to create a Middle East that's going to work for everyone.
Let me get another question in here. Lacey Dickinson, she's a project manager from Philadelphia. She co-founded a social media company called Feminist News. She says she's voting for you in November. What's your question?
Good evening.
Good evening.
As everyone knows, the Black Lives Matter movement has raised a lot of awareness around violence that's been committed against people of color, and it's also exposed a great incompetence in many local police forces. What do you think the role of the federal government should be in kind of structuring and working with local forces, and how would you work to ensure that officers are brought to justice who kill citizens?
Great. Thank you. Really critical question. Very much the question of the hour when we're seeing a new tragedy unfold almost on a daily basis. So this is a crisis, and it's very much related, I think, to an ongoing crisis of racial injustice that really has been kind of a continuing legacy from the criminal institution of slavery on which this country was founded. From slavery to lynchings to Jim Crow to segregation, mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and now police violence. So we have a deep problem here. And I want to suggest a couple of things we need to do. Some of them are focused and some of them are very big. So number one, we need to ensure that every community has a civilian review board so that communities are in charge of their police instead of having police in charge of their communities, for starters. We need to ensure that every community has access to an independent investigator. So it doesn't require an act of God in Washington, D.C. and the Department of Justice to find out what happened. I think any death at the hands of police needs to be investigated. And then on the big end, we're calling for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so that we can actually understand what is this living legacy of fear, of racism, of incredible racial bias, that the police violence is just the tip of the iceberg, because we have bias in our judicial system, in our prison system, you know, which is mass incarceration largely for people of color, an economy where the average African American family has 5 cents of wealth on the dollar that an average Caucasian family has, just through the cumulative impact of economic bias and unfairness. Incredible health disparities, 7 years off the average lifespan of someone just for living while black. You know, there are incredible just disparities and violence, economic violence, social violence, that has to be dealt with. We're calling for this Truth and Reconciliation Commission so we can share our stories, we can share music, art, have a facilitated conversation that our campaign hopes to help engender, so that we can come to terms with who we are as human beings and overcome this legacy that's dividing us.
Mr. Baraka, I want you to weigh in on this. I've read a lot of what you've had to say about this, and there